"This room will be easier for you, Mom." That's what my daughter said as she stood in the doorway, smiling like she was doing me a favor, her hand resting lightly on the frame of a door that didn't even open all the way because the dresser inside blocked it halfway. I looked past her into the space they had chosen for me, if you could call it that, barely large enough for a twin bed, a narrow nightstand, and a single lamp that cast a dim yellow light across walls that felt closer than they should have been. The window was small, tucked high, letting in a strip of daylight that never quite reached the floor. I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I just stood there holding a cardboard box with everything they said I would need: folded clothes, a framed photo, a few books I hadn't touched in years, as if a lifetime could be reduced to what fit inside 12 by 12 inches of space. "It's just temporary," she added, her voice soft, reasonable, the way people speak when they've already decided something for you. I heard her. I heard every word. But what I noticed more was what she didn't say. She didn't ask if I was okay with it. She didn't wait for an answer. Behind her, I could see my old room, the one I had slept in for over 20 years, the one with the wide windows and the oak dresser my husband built with his own hands, now stripped bare, the bed already made with new sheets that weren't mine. My son-in-law walked past me then, carrying a box of their things into that room like it had always belonged to them, like I was the one passing through. "This just makes more sense," he said, not even looking at me, his voice flat, efficient, like he was rearranging furniture instead of a person's life. I stepped inside the small room. The air felt different, still, like it had been waiting to be filled by someone who didn't matter. I set the box down on the bed and ran my hand along the edge of the mattress, noticing how the sheets didn't quite fit, corners loose, fabric thin. I closed the door behind me, and for a moment, I just stood there in the quiet. No one knocked. No one checked. No one asked if I needed help. That was the first thing I understood. This wasn't about space. It wasn't about convenience. It was about control. They didn't just move me into a smaller room that day. They moved me out of the life I thought I still had. And I let them. I let them believe I didn't see it. I let them believe I would adjust, that I would shrink to fit whatever corner they gave me. I even thanked them that night at dinner, smiled politely while they talked about renovations and future plans that didn't include me, as if I was already a guest in my own home. But what they didn't understand, what they couldn't see, was that I had spent 72 years learning how to survive loss quietly. And that kind of silence doesn't mean surrender. It means you're paying attention. Because the day they decided to downsize my life was the same day I started deciding what theirs would look like without me in it. I woke up the next morning before anyone else, not because I could not sleep, but because the room did not let me forget where I was. The air felt tighter, heavier, like it belonged to someone else, and I was only borrowing it. For a moment, I stayed still, staring at the ceiling that seemed lower than it should have been, listening to the silence of a house that used to feel like mine. Then I sat up slowly, careful not to hit my elbow against the wall that was too close, and placed my feet on the cold floor. I did not turn on the lamp. I did not need the light. I already knew what this room looked like. I had seen it clearly the moment I stepped inside. Instead, I opened the small closet and began hanging my clothes one by one, each hanger sliding into place with a soft, controlled sound. I did not rush. I did not sigh. I folded what did not fit and placed it neatly into a plastic bin they had given me, labeled in my daughter's handwriting, winter items, as if my life could be sorted into categories that no longer mattered. By the time the sun came through that narrow window, I was already dressed, sitting at the edge of the bed with my hands resting in my lap, waiting. When I walked into the kitchen, my daughter was making coffee, her back to me, humming softly like nothing had changed. My son-in-law was scrolling through his phone at the table, a mug already in front of him, steam rising in slow curls. "Good morning, Mom," she said without turning around. I answered her the same way I always had. Calm. Steady. "Good morning." I poured myself a cup and sat down across from them, noticing how my usual chair had been moved slightly to the side, just enough that it no longer aligned with the table the way it used to. No one mentioned it. No one needed to. "Did you sleep okay?" she asked, finally looking at me with a small, practiced smile. I nodded once. I did. It was not a lie. I had slept. But sleep and rest are not the same thing. They began talking about their plans for the day, contractors coming by, measurements being taken, ideas for the room that used to be mine. I listened without interrupting, stirring my coffee slowly, watching the surface settle each time the spoon stopped moving. That was when I noticed it. The folder on the counter. It was not there yesterday. Thin. Beige. Tucked just slightly under a stack of mail, but not hidden. I stood up without a word, walked over, and picked it up. "What is this?" I asked, my voice even. My daughter hesitated for just a second, then stepped closer. "Oh, that. It is just some paperwork. Nothing urgent." I opened it anyway. Property documents. Mortgage statements. Names. Signatures. I recognized mine. And I recognized something else too. Their names, appearing in places they had never been before. I did not react. I did not ask another question. I simply closed the folder and placed it back exactly where I found it. Then I returned to my seat and took another sip of my coffee, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue. That was the second thing I understood. This was never temporary. And they were not waiting for my permission. They were waiting for my silence. So I gave it to them. Every word they expected me to say, every protest they assumed I would make, I held it back. I smiled when appropriate. I nodded when necessary. And that afternoon, when they left the house to meet with their contractor, I did something they did not expect. I picked up the phone. And I called someone who had known my name long before they ever thought they owned it. The voice on the other end of the line did not ask me unnecessary questions. That was why I had kept his number all these years, written neatly in the back of an old address book I never threw away. "Margaret Collins," he said after I gave my name, his tone steady, professional, the same as I remembered. It has been a long time. I sat at the small desk in that room they had given me, the phone pressed gently to my ear, my eyes resting on the wall in front of me as if it could hold the weight of everything I was not saying out loud. "It has," I replied. "I need to review some documents." I did not explain why. I did not mention my daughter or her husband. I did not say the word control or betrayal or anything that might have sounded emotional. I spoke the way I had learned to speak in moments that mattered, clear, precise, without decoration. "Of course," he said. "Bring whatever you have. We will go through it carefully." I thanked him, hung up, and placed the receiver back in its cradle with a quiet click that sounded louder than it should have. For a moment, I stayed seated, my hands resting flat on the desk, feeling the smooth surface beneath my palms. Then I stood, walked to the closet, and reached for the box where I had placed my important papers years ago, long before any of this began. I had always kept things in order. Not because I expected to need them this way, but because I understood something simple. If you do not keep track of your life, someone else will do it for you. I carried the box to the bed and opened it slowly. Inside were folders, each labeled in my handwriting, property, accounts, insurance, things that once felt like responsibilities and now felt like protection. I pulled out the deed first. My name was there. Only mine. I remembered the day I signed those papers, sitting beside my husband at a wooden table that no longer existed, the two of us agreeing that no matter what happened, the house would always remain secure. After he passed, I kept that promise. I paid every bill. I handled every repair. I stayed when it would have been easier to leave. I built a life inside those walls that did not depend on anyone else's approval. And now, somehow, I was expected to believe that a few conversations at the kitchen table could change all of that. I closed the folder and set it aside, then reached for the next one, reading each document carefully, not because I did not trust what was written, but because I needed to see it with my own eyes. Line by line. Signature by signature. There were no surprises in those papers. Not yet. But there was something else. A pattern. Small changes. Additions that did not belong to the past I remembered. Names appearing where they had never been before. I did not react. I did not rush. I simply placed each document back into the box in the exact order I found it. That was the third thing I understood. They thought this was already done. They thought I would accept what had been arranged around me without looking closely. But I had spent too many years paying attention to details that other people ignored. I knew how quickly something could be taken when you stopped watching it. That afternoon, I got dressed, picked up the box, and walked out of that small room without hesitation. The house was quiet. They had not returned yet. I did not leave a note. I did not need to. As I stepped outside and closed the front door behind me, I realized something that felt clearer than anything else I had known in weeks. They had already decided where I belonged inside that house. Now it was my turn to decide where they belonged in mine. I had not driven that road in years, but my hands remembered it better than my mind did, turning left where the old gas station used to be, slowing down near the courthouse where my husband and I once stood on a warm June afternoon signing papers that felt permanent at the time, papers that were supposed to protect what we built together. The building looked the same, quiet, unassuming, a place where decisions were made without raised voices or second chances. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment with the box resting on the passenger seat, my reflection faintly visible in the windshield. 72 years of living teaches you many things, but one of them is this: nothing important ever feels dramatic when it is happening. It feels quiet, controlled, almost ordinary. I picked up the box, stepped out of the car, and walked inside without hesitation. The receptionist looked up and smiled politely, the kind of smile you give someone you do not recognize, but want to help anyway. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I have an appointment," I said, giving my name. She nodded and gestured toward a chair. "He will be with you shortly." I sat down, placing the box carefully at my feet, my hands folded in my lap, my posture straight, the way I had always carried myself even when I felt anything but steady. A few minutes later, the door opened, and he stepped out, older than I remembered but unchanged in the ways that mattered. "Margaret," he said, extending his hand. "Come in." His office was exactly as I expected, organized, quiet, the kind of place where words were chosen carefully because they had consequences. I placed the box on his desk and opened it without being asked. "I need to understand what has been done," I said. He did not interrupt. He did not assume. He simply pulled the first folder closer and began reading, his eyes moving slowly across each page, his expression giving nothing away. The room was silent except for the soft sound of paper shifting and the ticking of a clock somewhere behind me. Minutes passed. Then more. I did not rush him. I did not fill the silence. I had learned long ago that the truth does not reveal itself faster just because you are uncomfortable waiting for it. Finally, he set one document aside and looked at me, his gaze steady, measured. "Did you sign anything recently?" he asked. I thought about it, not in a hurry, but carefully, replaying the past few weeks in my mind, every conversation, every paper placed in front of me, every moment where someone might have expected me not to read closely. "No," I said. "Not without knowing exactly what it was." He nodded once, then tapped a page lightly with his finger. "Your name is still the primary owner," he said. "But there are attempts here to position them for control, joint access, future transfer." He paused, letting the words settle before continuing. "It is not complete. Not yet." I felt something shift inside me then, not relief, not anger, but clarity. They had started something they believed would finish itself. They had assumed time and silence would do the rest. "Can it be stopped?" I asked. He leaned back slightly, folding his hands together. "It can be more than stopped," he said. "It can be reversed, secured, and protected in a way that leaves no room for interpretation." I held his gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Then that is what I want." There was no hesitation in my voice, no uncertainty left to hide behind. He reached for a blank notepad, uncapped his pen, and began outlining steps in precise, deliberate strokes. Trusts, account structures, beneficiary changes, legal barriers that would not rely on anyone's goodwill. I listened to each word, each option, each consequence, and for the first time since I stepped into that small room, I understood something fully. They had been planning quietly. But so had I. The difference was, I was not doing it to take something that was not mine. I was doing it to make sure what was mine stayed that way. When I walked back into the house that evening, Nothing had changed on the surface, and that was exactly how I wanted it. The kitchen lights were on, the sound of dishes moving came from the sink, and my daughter glanced over her shoulder with that same easy expression she had mastered so well. "You were out," she said, as if it was a small detail, as if I had simply gone for a short walk instead of stepping into a room where everything about my future had just been rewritten. I placed my purse down in the same spot I always had and nodded once. I had a few things to take care of. She did not ask what those things were. She did not need to. In her mind, my world had already been reduced to something small, manageable, predictable. My son-in-law was sitting at the table again, his laptop open this time, numbers and charts reflecting faintly on the screen. He looked up briefly, gave me a polite nod, then returned to whatever calculation he believed mattered more. I moved through the kitchen slowly, deliberately, taking in the details I had stopped noticing before. The new set of keys hanging on the hook by the door, slightly different from the old ones. The stack of envelopes on the counter, addressed in handwriting that was not mine. The way my old chair had been pushed just a little further out of place. These were not accidents. These were decisions. "We were talking about the layout," my daughter continued, wiping her hands on a towel as she turned toward me. "There is a lot we can do with the space now. It just feels more efficient." I nodded again, as if I agreed, as if efficiency had ever been the point of a home. "I am sure it does," I said calmly. She smiled, relieved perhaps that I was not going to question her, that I was fitting into the version of me she had already created in her mind. That was the fourth thing I understood. They were not just changing the house. They were changing the story. And in their version, I was already a smaller part of it. Dinner was quiet, almost pleasant in a way that felt rehearsed. They spoke about timelines, contractors, future plans that stretched months ahead, each sentence building a life where I was present but no longer central. I listened. I nodded when appropriate. I asked simple questions that gave nothing away. And when the conversation drifted to finances, to projections, to what they called long-term stability, I paid closer attention. "It just makes sense to streamline everything," my son-in-law said, his voice steady, confident. "Fewer complications down the line." I set my fork down gently and looked at him for a moment, not long enough to be noticed, but long enough to understand exactly what he believed. Simplicity, in his mind, meant control. Fewer complications meant fewer people who could say no. "That sounds very organized," I replied. He nodded, satisfied, and returned to his plate. After dinner, I cleared my dishes, washed them carefully, dried them, and placed them back where they belonged. I did everything the same way I always had, not because nothing had changed, but because everything had. When I returned to that small room, I closed the door quietly behind me and sat down at the desk. I opened the folder he had given me earlier, the one filled with notes, instructions, steps that would take what they assumed was theirs and place it somewhere they could not reach. I read each line again, slowly, making sure I understood not just what needed to be done, but when. Timing mattered. Precision mattered. Silence mattered most of all. I placed the folder back into the drawer, turned off the lamp, and lay down on the narrow bed. The room still felt small, but it no longer felt like a limit. It felt like a starting point. Because while they were busy making plans for the space around me, I had already begun making plans for the space they would no longer have access to, and the difference between us was simple. They believed this house defined my life. I knew my life defined what happened to this house next. I did not start the next morning with urgency. That was the mistake they would have expected. Instead, I followed the same rhythm I had always followed, waking early, making my bed with careful hands, folding the blanket so the corners aligned, placing the pillow exactly where it belonged. Control begins with small things. People forget that. In the kitchen, I poured my coffee and stood by the window, watching the light stretch slowly across the yard that I had once tended myself, back when every inch of that space answered to me. My daughter came in a few minutes later, already dressed, already moving with purpose, her phone in one hand, her attention divided. "We have someone coming at 10, she said, not asking, just informing. "They need to look at the upstairs again." I nodded. "Of course." I did not remind her that it was my house. I did not need to. That reminder was no longer for her. It was for me. Over the next few days, I watched everything more closely. Not in a way that drew attention, not in a way that would make them defensive, but in a way that allowed me to understand the full shape of what they were building. Contractors came and went. Measurements were taken. Walls were discussed as if they were already gone. My old room changed first. New furniture arrived, larger, brighter, positioned to claim the space completely. The dresser my husband had built was moved into the garage without a word, covered with a sheet like something being stored rather than remembered. I walked past it once, running my fingers lightly over the edge of the wood beneath the fabric, feeling the grooves he had carved by hand decades ago. I did not stop. I did not lift the cover. Some things are not preserved by holding onto them. They are preserved by knowing when to let them go. Each afternoon, when the house emptied out, I followed the list I had been given. Quietly. Precisely. I made calls that did not take long but carried weight far beyond their length. I confirmed account numbers. I updated information that had not been changed in years. I moved what needed to be moved without creating any visible disturbance. There was no dramatic moment. No confrontation. Just a series of decisions, each one closing a door they did not even know existed. At night, I returned to the small room, sat at the desk, and reviewed everything again, making sure there were no gaps, no assumptions left unverified. I wrote notes in a small notebook I kept hidden beneath the drawer, not because I feared being discovered, but because clarity matters more when you are the only one protecting it. My daughter remained kind in the way people are kind when they believe they are right. She brought me tea one evening, placed it on the desk, and smiled. "I know this is an adjustment," she said gently, "but it is for the best." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment I saw the child she used to be, the one who would sit at the kitchen table swinging her legs, asking questions about everything. Then the moment passed. "I understand," I said. And I did. Just not in the way she thought. Because what she saw as improvement, I saw as replacement. What she saw as efficiency, I saw as erasure. And while she believed she was organizing the future, I was securing it. By the end of the week, everything was in place. Not visible. Not obvious. But complete. The structure they had been building around me no longer had anything to attach to. They just did not know it yet. And that was the point. Because timing is not about speed. It is about certainty. And I was certain now. The next step would not be quiet. But it would be final. It happened on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that feels ordinary until it is not. My daughter was in the kitchen again, scrolling through her phone, her coffee untouched as she spoke to someone about delivery schedules and installation timelines. My son-in-law was already dressed, keys in hand, moving with that same quiet confidence he had carried for weeks, like everything ahead of him had already been secured. I walked in, poured my coffee, and took my usual place, the chair still slightly out of line, the detail they never noticed, but I never forgot. "We should finalize the paperwork this week," he said, not to me, but in front of me, as if I were part of the furniture now, something present but not involved. "It will make everything cleaner going forward." My daughter nodded, her voice light, agreeable. "I think that is a good idea." I took a slow sip of my coffee and set the cup down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table. "What paperwork?" I asked, my tone even, not confrontational, just enough to remind them that I was still there. There was a brief pause, the kind that lasts only a second, but reveals more than any explanation. "Just some updates," my daughter said. "Nothing complicated." I nodded once, as if that answer satisfied me, and returned to my coffee. It was not the answer that mattered. It was the assumption behind it. They believed I would not look closely. They believed I would not ask twice. They believed I had already accepted my place. That was when I knew the timing was right. Later that morning, after they left, I made one final call. Not to ask questions. Not to confirm details. But to move forward. "Everything is ready," I said when he answered. "Then we proceed," he replied. There was no hesitation on either side. The documents had been prepared, reviewed, secured in ways that did not rely on trust, only on structure. By the time the afternoon light shifted across the living room floor, the process had already begun. Accounts that had once been accessible were no longer shared. Authorizations that had been assumed were no longer valid. Ownership that had been quietly approached was now clearly defined, protected, and beyond interpretation. There was no announcement. No visible change. The house looked the same. The walls stood where they had always stood. The furniture remained in place. But underneath it, everything had shifted. That evening, they came home later than usual, talking about progress, about next steps, about the future they were certain was unfolding exactly as they planned. I listened from the doorway for a moment before stepping in, carrying a small stack of envelopes I had placed neatly together. "These came for you," I said, setting them on the table. My son-in-law glanced at them briefly, distracted, then picked one up. "Probably just confirmations," he said, almost dismissively, as he tore it open. I watched his expression change, not dramatically, not all at once, but in a series of small adjustments, his eyes slowing as he read, his posture shifting as the meaning settled in. My daughter reached for another envelope, her movements quicker now, less certain. "What is this?" she asked, her voice no longer as steady as before. I did not answer immediately. I walked to the counter, set my purse down, and turned to face them fully. "That," I said calmly, "is what clean looks like." The room fell quiet then, the kind of silence that does not invite interruption. They looked at each other, then back at the papers, then at me, as if trying to place me somewhere familiar again. But there was no familiar version left. "You cannot just change things like this," my son-in-law said finally, his voice controlled but tighter than before. I held his gaze for a moment, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. "I did not just change things," I replied. "I corrected them." And for the first time since they moved me into that small room, they understood something they had not considered before. I had never stopped being the one who decided what belonged to whom. They had just stopped paying attention to it. They did not speak right away. That was the first real change. Before, there was always a response, always a quick explanation, a reason, a reassurance that everything was under control. But now, they just stood there, papers in their hands, reading lines they had not expected to see, names that were no longer where they thought they would be, access that had quietly disappeared without a single conversation. My daughter was the first to break the silence. "Mom, what did you do?" Her voice was softer now, not gentle, but uncertain, like she was trying to find the right tone for something she did not fully understand yet. I did not move closer. I did not raise my voice. I simply stood where I was, steady, the same way I had stood when they first showed me that small room. "I made sure everything reflects what is true," I said. She shook her head slightly, scanning the pages again, as if reading them a second time would change what they said. "This does not make sense. We talked about this. We agreed." She stopped herself, the words trailing off before they could form into something solid. "Because we had never agreed." Not really. There had been conversations, yes. Suggestions. Assumptions. But agreement requires two voices, not one speaking while the other is expected to accept. My son-in-law set his paper down on the table, more carefully this time, like it had weight he had not accounted for. "These changes are significant," he said, his tone measured, but no longer confident. "You cannot just restructure everything without discussing it." I looked at him for a moment, long enough for him to understand that I had heard every word. "You moved me into a different room without discussing it," I replied. There was no anger in my voice. Just a simple statement, placed exactly where it needed to be. My daughter looked between us, her expression shifting, not quite defensive, not quite apologetic, but something in between. "That was different," she said quickly. "That was about making things work better for everyone." I nodded once. "And this is about making things accurate." The room fell quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not confusion. Not hesitation. Something closer to realization. They began asking questions then, not all at once, but in pieces. What accounts had changed? What documents had been updated? What it meant for the house, for the future, for the plans they had already started making. I answered only what needed to be answered, nothing more. I did not explain my reasoning. I did not defend my decisions. I simply clarified the facts. Access had been removed where it was no longer appropriate. Ownership had been secured where it had always belonged. Future control had been placed somewhere it could not be assumed. My daughter sat down slowly, the paper still in her hands, her eyes moving across the lines again, but this time not searching for errors, searching for understanding. "So, what happens now?" she asked quietly. I walked to the table then, not hurried, not hesitant, and placed my hand lightly on the back of the chair that had once been mine. "Now," I said, "everything stays exactly where it should have been all along." My son-in-law exhaled slowly, leaning back slightly, the structure he had been building in his mind no longer fitting the reality in front of him. "This complicates things," he said. I met his gaze without shifting. "No," I replied. "It removes confusion." And that was when they understood it fully. Not through emotion, not through argument, but through the simple fact that nothing they had planned could move forward the way they expected. The house had not changed. The walls were still there. The rooms were still the same size. But the foundation they thought they were standing on had been redefined. And for the first time, they were the ones trying to find their place inside it. The house felt different that night, not because anything had physically changed, but because the assumptions that once filled it were gone. My daughter moved more quietly, her footsteps softer as she walked down the hallway, as if the space required a different kind of respect now. My son-in-law stayed at the table longer than usual, the papers still spread out in front of him, reading them again, then again, as though repetition might reveal a version of reality that worked in his favor. I did not interrupt them. I did not offer comfort. Some things are not meant to be softened. They are meant to be understood. I returned to my room, the small one they had chosen for me, and closed the door gently behind me. For a moment, I stood there, looking around at the narrow walls, the single lamp, the bed that had once felt like a reduction of everything I was. But it did not feel that way anymore. It was just a room. Nothing more. Nothing less. The meaning they had attached to it no longer held any weight. I sat down at the desk and opened the drawer where I kept my notebook, flipping through the pages I had written over the past week, each line a quiet step toward something they had never considered. I read them one last time, not to check for mistakes, but to acknowledge the path I had taken to get here. Then I closed it and placed it back where it belonged. In the days that followed, the conversations changed. They were more careful now, more deliberate, choosing words instead of assuming them. My daughter asked questions she had not asked before, not about control or plans, but about what I wanted, about what I needed. I answered her honestly, but simply. I did not rebuild what had been lost. I did not return to the version of myself that accepted less in the name of keeping peace. My son-in-law kept his distance, not out of disrespect, but out of recognition. He had underestimated something he could not measure, and now he was adjusting to it. The contractors stopped coming as often. The plans they had been so certain about slowed, then paused, then quietly disappeared from conversation altogether. The house settled into a different rhythm, one that did not revolve around expansion or rearrangement, but around balance. I did not move back into my old room right away. That was not the point. This had never been about the size of the space. It had been about who decided what that space meant. One afternoon, my daughter stood in the doorway of my room, her hand resting lightly against the frame, the same way it had been the day everything started. "Mom," she said, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. "You can have your room back. We can move things around." I looked at her for a moment, seeing not the person who had made decisions without me, but the person who was beginning